In Vancouver, reconciliation can feel like a word you hear at a ceremony and then forget the minute rent is due. But in 2025-2026, reconciliation has been showing up in a much more tangible form. Land back, not as a single organization, not as one policy, but as a wide umbrella for a pretty simple idea. If reconciliation is real, it eventually has to touch land, jurisdiction, and material repair, not just symbolism. Land back, in plain language, and why people argue about it, at its core, land back pushes for Indigenous nations to regain control over lands and waters, sometimes through title, sometimes through treaty implementation, sometimes through co-management, and sometimes through the return of specific sacred or culturally significant sites. A big part of the public confusion is that land back gets framed online like a gotcha headline. Are they coming for private homes? In late 2025, Canadian commentary and reporting had to address this directly because fear-based narratives were spreading fast. One widely shared piece put it bluntly: Indigenous peoples are not coming to seize your privately owned land. Even as court cases and title discussions become more visible, 25.5 made reconciliation feel more concrete. In British Columbia, 2025 included a very literal example. The province returned the Lightning Rock site, 36 hectares, described as sacred land, to Chamath First Nation as part of reconciliation work. Land returns like this matter because they move reconciliation from acknowledgement to restitution, a transfer of actual place, not just language. At the same time, legal and political debates sharpened around Aboriginal title and what it could mean in urban or developed areas. In October 2025, coverage of a major Cowichan-related title discussion in BC ignited fierce debate, partly because people often hear title and instantly imagine chaos for property law. Yet legal analysis around the same moment emphasized that land questions in BC are long-standing and that Aboriginal title is not some brand new invention. It's part of the legal landscape Canada has been wrestling with for generations. And beyond BC, land disputes were also making headlines in ways that forced Canadians to confront what restitution looks like when it's not theoretical. In August 2025, a stretch of beach along Lake Huron was returned to Saugeen First Nation after a long dispute. Reporting noted both the local backlash and the legal narrowness of the decision. Reconciliation isn't only land. Sometimes it's what was taken. Land-back conversations often connect to cultural restitution, too. In November 2025, international news covered the Vatican returning 62 Indigenous artifacts to Canada. It's not the same as returning land, but it's still a form of material repair. And it raises the same hard questions. Who had the power to take? Who gets to decide what return looks like now? The systems side, rights, governance, and money, not just vibes. One reason land back gained traction in 2025 is that it lines up with ongoing policy and legal shifts about Indigenous self-determination. Scholarly work in 2025 points to how reconciliation isn't only interpersonal, it's institutional, affecting governance and law. For example, research discussing Indigenous jurisdiction in child and family systems highlights how Canadian courts and legislation can recognize Indigenous authority in concrete ways. Another version of back that isn't only about acres, but about decision-making power. Meanwhile, the conversation about Canada implementing UNDRIP continues to be tracked and graded. The Assembly of First Nations 2025 report card on Canada's UNDRIP action plan measures reflects that progress is uneven, exactly the kind of okay, but is it happening? Accountability lens that landback supporters keep demanding. And then there's the money. Treaties are not just history, they're contracts with consequences. In early 2025, major reporting followed First Nations seeking compensation for unpaid treaty promises connected to the Robinson Treaties, with negotiations and litigation highlighting how reconciliation can mean billions of dollars and a rethinking of how wealth was generated from Indigenous lands. Social media didn't invent land back, but it turbocharged it. Land back is also a media ecosystem now. Educational pages and popular creators regularly explain it in digestible language, sometimes more clearly than politicians do. For instance, a widely shared crash course style post framed land back as not only about people returning to land, but also about restoring land health and Indigenous stewardship. Indigenous organizations also use Instagram Reels and year-in-review style content to keep reconciliation from fading into seasonal statements. That matters because in Vancouver, where people are online, political, and tired, movements live or die by whether they can stay understandable. Hashtags like Ichas Land Back help people find each other, but they also attract misinformation, which is why late 2025 me busting became part of the conversation. Heading into 2026, the Vancouver version of the question. So what does this mean for millennial Vancouverites in 2026? It means reconciliation is increasingly being measured by deliverables. Is land actually being returned or co-governed? Are courts and governments recognizing Indigenous jurisdiction in practice, not just principle? Are treaty obligations treated like real obligations, including financial repair? Can public conversation stay grounded in facts instead of fear? Land back makes people uncomfortable because it's not asking for a nicer speech. It's asking who gets to decide what happens on the land beneath Vancouver's feet. And in 2025, 2026, that stopped being a purely abstract debate and started looking like policy announcements, court arguments, land transfers, restitution efforts, and a social media-fueled public education campaign, loud, imperfect, and very real.